I watched the first couple of minutes of a video on from Fora TV yesterday. I think the main video was on the premium channel, so you've got to pay for it or something, but I'll try and get to see the rest of it. But it was this guy talking about daydreaming, and daydreaming and walking, interesting enough, which I thought was pertinent to the kind of things I do. And it was, in a sense, it was quite kind of coincidental for me, because I've been talking to some of my students about daydreaming last week. So, because my new students arrived a couple of weeks ago, my new first years. And I usually do this thing about, you know, the value of different kinds of thinking and how we associate kind of academic activity, particularly, you know, if my students have come through a very particularly kind of academic route, that we associate academic thinking with you know, a particular thinking style, which is the opposite of daydreaming. You know, it's highly focused, it's highly concentrated, it's terribly wide awake, it's all kind of beta in the brain, as opposed to whatever daydreaming is, alpha or gamma or whatever. I'm basically saying that, you know, daydreaming is really important, and you know, you can gain some control over how that builds itself into your working processes and into your life. And I was kind of recommending that, particularly for, obviously my students are theatre students, artists, so it's easy to get the credibility across there, but I actually think it's really important in all kinds of areas. But back to this Fora TV thing, this guy was saying, well, several things actually. He related daydreaming to what he called the default mode, I guess, the default mode that the brain occupies, which is this kind of background activation pattern that the brain settles into from time to time. I don't know, you know, what it relates to in terms of those alpha, beta, gamma things I mentioned a minute ago, but there's this default activation pattern which I did read about a while back in Scientific American, and as I said, he's saying that daydreaming is the time when we're awake when we drop into that, which is fine. And he was also saying that daydreaming, that state, correlates very highly with divergent thinking, as he put it, or creativity, or just being able to be imaginative. Particularly, he said, if you are the kind of person who is able to identify that daydreaming process. So if you're reading a book, and then halfway down the page you just feel yourself slipping off into imagination land, if you recognise that happening, then there's a high level of correlation, as I say, between you as a person who does that kind of activity and recognises it, between that and, as I say, divergent and creative thinking, problem solving, pattern recognition, all that kind of stuff. Which I guess implies that if you daydream without knowing you're daydreaming, if you're just a kind of spacey person who drops in and out of the default state without having some cognizance of that, then there's probably less correlation. I'm not sure about that, I'll have to check. But that makes a lot of sense. The other thing he was saying is that daydreaming has a kind of bad rep in our culture, and increasingly we try to find ways of taking that out of our experience. You know, it's not enough just to sit on a train. I think this is his example actually. It's not enough just to sit on a train for us anymore and look out the window and let this experience of the world going past just kind of lull you into this default state. We don't do that. You know, we take that opportunity to check our email, or to send off a few texts, or to make some notes about something, or I don't know, whatever it is we're doing, play a video game. And he says that's a shame. You know, it might well be the case if we see this daydream, if we see this default state not as just downtime, but as necessarily productive time, where the substrate of thinking is being reworked and processed and enriched. So I think it's probably a better way of looking at it. That's certainly how I talk about it to my students. Daydreaming. The other thing I was saying, when I'm not absolutely sure of my facts here, is that daydreaming is, but I like the idea of it, is that daydreaming happens all the time. You know, we're daydreaming all the time, even when we're wide awake. You know, all this activation is still going on, all this processing is still going on, even while you're completely wide awake. You just don't see it. It's a bit like not seeing the stars in the daytime. See, there's all those, there's the sky, you can probably see maybe you'll be able to see contrails of some airplanes. what you will not be able to see on this video right now is stars, but they are definitely up there. You just can't bloody see them because it's too bright. You know, the light is too bright. That the light from the stars and the connections between those lights, the constellations, and you know, all that kind of interesting beauty is hidden by the it's just overlaid and washed out and bleached out by the bright light of day. And it's the same thing with daydreaming, I think. We have all these daydreams going on, but conscious, wide awake experience is so bright and so vivid and so full of colour and objects and stuff and things moving and social relationships and dogs and cats and fences and trees, that all the daydreaming stuff is just way back. I mean, obviously if you close your eyes and get quiet for a bit, you can kind of feel it again. And I know when, well, something like I did a little bit of Vipassana meditation for a while, and in part of that and in other meditative practices, one of the things you do after you've allowed a kind of perception of your body to take place and a perception of your emotions to take place, you allow a perception of thoughts or daydreams to take place. So you kind of let the daydreams happen. So you can kind of see things and feel things, and all that thought is taking place, all that processing is happening, which just normally happens in the dark, or happens where the stars are, or happens outside of consciousness. You just let that float across the screen of your darkened vision, and just kind of watch the movie, watch it go, which again I think is fascinating. And I would imagine also, given what I just said about this chap on 4TV saying there's a correlation there with divergent thinking, you know, it seems quite likely to me that something like meditative practices which identify that would probably also correlate with creativity, divergent thinking, pattern recognition, ability to, you know, do all those fancy stuff that seems to require, as I say, this bedrock, this background of highly fertile default thinking. Daydreaming. Yeah, great stuff.